Lore of the Old World, Chapter 5 The Coming of Sigmar. Far to the north of Nehekara, a mighty warrior and bold leader would unite the warring tribes of men against their common enemies. Under his rule, the Orc and Goblin tribes were driven from their lands, and in his name an empire was founded that would endure until the world's end. West of the World's Edge Mountains, dense forests stretched for league upon league, eventually giving way to salt-laden marshlands where they met the distant coast. Here lived many tribes of barbarous humans, each struggling tirelessly for survival against the seemingly endless number of beastmen, orcs and goblins that plagued the lands, eternally hungering for plunder and battle. As their civilization developed, these human tribes had begun to trade with the dwarfs, learning from them the secrets of metalwork and trading for harvest for the finest dwarf-made weapons and armor. Yet it was not until a chance meeting that a true alliance was formed. Traveling through the lands of the Unberogan tribe with his bodyguards, the dwarf High King Kurgan Ironbeard was attacked by raiding orcs. The dwarfs fought valiantly, but, greatly outnumbered, fell one by one until only the king remained. By chance, warriors of the Unberogan tribe, led by their chieftain's son Sigmar, came upon the massacre and rushed to the High King's rescue. Sigmar led the charge, snatching the High King's fallen warhammer from the ground and swinging it mightily, slaying a dozen orcs with each blow. So grateful was Kurgan, and so impressed by Sigmar's bravery, that he gifted the young prince his mighty runic warhammer, Gal Maraz. Through this meeting, mighty bonds of friendship were forged between the bold and brash young Sigmar and the gruff, taciturn Kurgan Ironbeard. From this friendship was formed a powerful alliance between the dwarves and the Unberogans. Yet the threat posed by the endless tribes of orcs and goblins from the east would continue to grow, endangering the realms of men and dwarf alike. When Sigmar succeeded his father as the chieftain of the Unberogan, he determined to unite the warring tribes of men under his banner and to drive their enemies from the lands. Through diplomacy and war, Sigmar forged a mighty coalition of tribes. Together with his dwarf allies, this coalition fought many wars against their mutual enemies, driving them from their lands. Yet for all their victories, the orc hordes continued to come, and one last epic battle remained. In Black Fire Pass, Sigmar and his tribal allies stood alongside Kurgan Ironbeard and a host of dwarfs, facing a near-endless horde of orcs and goblins. Despite vicious fighting and their horrendous losses, the army of men and dwarfs prevailed. The power of the orcs in the west was broken, and their primary route from the Badlands into the lands of men was closed. With this great victory, Sigmar had unified his realm and was hailed emperor by his loyal chieftains. For 50 years Sigmar ruled his empire, and under his rule his people prospered greatly. Mighty cities grew from tribal strongholds, dwarf engineers teaching their human allies the craft of stonework and masonry, building great walls, roads, and temples. At the age of 80, still hale and healthy, Sigmar decided to relinquish his throne and travel east into the World's Edge Mountains. What he planned, none know. Some say he wished to visit his old friend Kurgan Ironbeard one last time. Others claim he had grown weary of peace and wished to test his mettle against the denizens of the Dark Lands. Whatever the truth, Sigmar passed the rule of his fledgling empire to the chieftains of the tribes of which it consisted. To avoid infighting, these wise rulers chose to elect one of their number to stand as emperor in Sigmar's stead, swearing oaths of loyalty and duty to their chosen leader as Sigmar looked on, his heart swelling with pride. In recognition of this act, Sigmar gifted Galmaraz to his successor and departed to the east. From this first election was formed a system that would endure for millennia, that of the Electoral College. In this manner the descendants of the tribal chieftains would come to be known by the title of Elector Count, and would meet to elect one of their number to reign as emperor when the need arose. Sigmar himself came to be worshipped as a god by his loyal subjects, and a great church spread across the lands to honour his name. Under Sigmar's rule, the territories of the tribal chieftains had each formed a self-governing province within his empire. These provinces continued to grow in power and influence, but they enjoyed little respite from anarchy and war. Rampaging orc and goblin warbands continued to sweep down from the mountains, their numbers increasing in the years after Sigmar's departure into the east, and in their wake the battlefields would be stained red with the blood of men. Beastmen rampaged through the dark forests of the Empire, destroying whole settlements and glutting themselves on the flesh of the slaughtered. Norscan longboats sailed from the frozen north to raid along the Empire's coast, burning and pillaging. Marauding tribes of barbarians came from the Troll country to slaughter and sacrifice in the name of their dark gods. Alongside these familiar enemies of old came new threats. Loathsome rat-men erupted from beneath the sewers of ever-growing cities, overrunning the streets, spreading plague and wreaking havoc, before vanishing once more into their tunnels. Shambling corpses under the command of wicked necromancers rose from their graves to wreak destruction upon the living, their inexorable march overwhelming entire armies. These and other horrors assailed the Empire each and every year in increasing numbers, but through the seemingly unbreakable alliances formed between the imperial provinces and with the inspired leadership of the Elector Counts, the armies of the Empire grew in strength, and each passing season standing eternally ready to face their enemies with courage and ingenuity. Through its many trials the Empire stood united, for a time at least. For 1,000 years the Empire prospered, and with the passing of each emperor the Elector Counts dutifully selected the best candidate to succeed to the throne. But with the untimely death of Boris Goldgather, often called Boris the Incompetent by prince and peasant alike, the Empire faced its greatest test. Boris had been an unpopular ruler, his reign marked by corruption and the suffering of his people. When Boris died of a terrible pestilence that swept through the lands, the Elector Counts could not agree on a successor, and for several years the throne sat empty. During this time the Empire faced invasion from within, as armies of mutant rat-men erupted from beneath its greatest cities. Had it not been for Graf Mandred von Zelt of Middenheim, the Empire might have been overrun by the combination of plague and the verminous legions. Mandred led the armies of Middenheim against the verminous invaders, and united his rival nobles to his cause. In a few short years, the loathsome rat-men had been driven from the Empire. In recognition of his popularity, the Elector Counts agreed unanimously to Mandred's ascension to the imperial throne. But upon Mandred's death, personal rivalries, conflicting ambitions, and petty jealousies divided the Elector Counts once more, and they proved unable to elect a successor. Blood was shed when these squabbles turned violent, and the Counts returned to their lands with anger in their hearts. Ottilia, the Elector Countess of Talabkland, proclaimed herself Empress, and declared war upon her main rival, the Elector Count of Stirland. The decades that followed saw a succession of emperors, as one pretender after another launched a bloody coup to claim the throne. There was even an era when there were two emperors at the same time, one the elected emperor, the other the Elector Count of Talabkland, who claimed a hereditary position as emperor following the self-appointed reign of Ottilia. In effect, Talabkland had seceded from the empire, and was joined at various times by other provinces that were dissatisfied with the current elected emperor. To make matters worse, in 1547 Count Siegfried of Middenland decided to declare himself emperor as well. This audacious proclamation marked the beginning of the age of three emperors, with each claimant soliciting allies and supporters among the others. The provinces of the empire had now become more or less ungovernable, and for the next 4 centuries the Elector Counts fought rivals within their own lands, as well as the numerous enemies that assailed them from without. As the power of the Elector Counts declined, the empire's cities looked more to their own affairs, and those that were not destroyed by war became prosperous under the leadership of burgomeisters, leaders elected from the mercantile classes and other wealthy citizens. Many of the larger cities began to construct fortifications and recruit their own standing armies, in effect becoming independent military, economic and political states separate from their surrounding provinces. With Sigmar's people divided into squabbling fiefdoms, enemies gathered in ever greater numbers at their borders, eagerly testing the empire's waning defences. In its weakened state, the empire became easy prey to its enemies. Rampaging armies of destruction fell upon several provinces which, finding themselves unable to rely upon support from the forces of their neighbours, suffered greatly. The worst such example came in 1705, when the Orc war boss Gorbad Ironclaw led a truly massive horde of orcs and goblins through Blackfire Pass. War Gorbad ravaged the southern corner of the empire to such an extent that the province of Soland, once rich and prosperous, was utterly destroyed. With its armies routed and its rulers slain, Soland was left a burnt and blackened wasteland by the rampaging orc hordes. Following the eventual defeat of the savage invaders, much of Soland was subsumed by neighbouring Wissenland. In the year 1979, many of the Elector counts had realised the need for a strong emperor to unify the warring nation. Through much diplomacy, a majority of those Elector counts who found themselves outliers in the contest for the throne came together and elected Margrethe of Marienburg as empress. Unfortunately, this act was to prove wildly unpopular with those electors not consulted, not least of whom was the head of the cult of Sigmar, the Grand Theogenist, who was granted a seat in the Electoral College in recognition of their rank and who refused outright to acknowledge the vote. Rather than unite the empire, the appointment of Margrethe led to ever greater hostilities, and within a few short years the electoral system had completely collapsed. The empire was, for all intents and purposes, no more. As the age of 3 emperors had dragged on, a new threat had grown within the dark and forested province of Sylvania. Through a combination of deception, sorcery, and bloody murder, a vampire named Vlad von Carstein had wrested control of the region from its previous ruler, Otto von Drac. Under Vlad's iron grip, Sylvania had grown strong, and the taint of vampirism had spread. For over 200 years, hiding his undying nature behind a string of different names, Vlad had ruled over Sylvania. The Elector counts looked on with indifference at these changes, too caught up in their own petty power struggles to care about such a backward corner of the empire. In 2010, as the empire slid into anarchy, Vlad launched his bid to become the immortal vampire emperor. Marching at the head of a host of undead, Vlad invaded Stirland and Ostermark before turning his attention to the heart of the empire and marching towards the Rietland. For several decades, vicious wars raged until eventually Vlad himself was laid low by the Grand Theogenist Wilhelm III. With Vlad's passing, his undead legions collapsed and crumbled to dust, but the threat posed by his infernal bloodline was far from ended, and other vampires rose to power in Sylvania who would continue to pursue Vlad's insane ambitions. The vampire wars raged on until the year 2145, when Manfred von Carstein, the most vicious and cunning of Vlad's descendants, was defeated at the Battle of Helfen by the armies of several Elector counts, briefly united against a common enemy. It has been over 2,000 years since Sigmar united the tribes of the central Old World into a mighty nation. For 1,000 of those years the empire grew and prospered, becoming wealthy through trade and innovation. Other nations benefited greatly from their alliances with the empire and its various provinces, and the kingdoms of Estalia, Britannia, and the city-states of Tilia all grew wealthy off trade with Sigmar's people. Yet strife and ruin, internal struggle, and invasion from without have all taken their toll upon the once great empire. Divided by politics and riven by the greed and short-sightedness of its rulers, the empire has become little more than a collection of warring city-states and loosely formed provinces under rule by pretenders who war with their neighbours bitterly, hoping to topple their rivals and claim the crown of the empire for their own, certain that only victory over their rivals will restore the fractured nation. Yet this endless cycle of war only further weakens the lands that were once the empire, every battle of the unending civil war costing the lives of brave soldiers. All the while, beastmen, orcs, goblins and darker things, creatures that find civilization anathema to their existence, gather beyond the borders, hidden in the mountains and forests. Overshadowing all these threats looms the corruption of chaos and the desires of the dark gods, their armies always gnawing at the edges of the old world or attacking it from within. Against those threats, mankind must stand united or be swept from the world. The Empire is arguably the most technologically advanced nation in the world. Its use of gunpowder, mechanical tools, and advanced metallurgy second only to the dwarfs. While the well-drilled state troops of the provincial armies might still fight with sword, spear, and halberd, they are backed up by mighty cannon, rows of handgunners or pistol-armed horsemen, not to mention the more esoteric weapons of war such as the dreaded Hellblaster volley guns or the rumbling steam tanks. The innovations of the Empire are principally focused on the industrious city of Nuln and its engineering schools, where new inventions from the Elector Count's armies are routinely produced and sold from Marienburg to Talabheim. Equally as important to the armies of the Empire as its cannons and handguns are the proud knightly orders. Expert warriors clad in heavy Gothic plate armor and mounted upon powerful war horses, they often exist outside the political structure of the Elector Counts and claimants to the imperial throne. Fighting for honor, prestige, or the articles of faith as laid down by their grand masters, these orders make powerful allies and deadly enemies to petty nobles with designs on rulership. Some knightly orders are populous, such as the Knights Panther, who have chapter houses in almost every major province. Others, like the Knights of the Ebon Tier, number only a few dozen warriors. Knightly orders might be a secular fighting caste like the Scions of the Blade, devoted only to the mastering the art of war, or dedicated to a god, like the grim Knights of Mor, who count themselves the soldiers of the Empire's god of death. Centuries of unrest have seen the Empire regress politically, resembling the scattered tribes once united by Sigmar. Chieftains replaced by dukes, princes and barons, kingdoms and tribal lands replaced with provinces and city-states. Presently there are 4 great power blocks in the Empire, each ruled at least in part by a claimant to the imperial throne. Westerland, ruled by the Empress Elspeth Margrethe VI, is the most prosperous region within the Empire, its great wealth derived from the port city of Marienburg. Unlike many imperial cities, Marienburg has not yet become an independent city-state, though its ruling burgomeisters wield great power and influence over the young Empress Elspeth Margrethe. The cult of Manan is a powerful faction within the city, and has its own influence upon the self-proclaimed Empress. For this reason, Margrethe is often known derisively by her rivals and detractors as the Sea Empress, or the Empress of Coin, as a reference to her being a puppet of the mercantile guild and the sea cult. Count Sigismund Ulrich rules Osterland. Its forests and mountains cover the northernmost reaches of the Empire, where it meets the southern borders of Kislev and the Sea of Claws. Politically, it encompasses large portions of Ostland, Ostermark, Hochland, and Middenland, though in truth it is a shadow of its former strength. Centuries ago, the Count of Middenheim claimed rulership of the north and was a claimant to the title of Emperor. This led to a line of so-called wolf emperors who have continued to press their claim for control of the empire. Despite these ambitions, the current count is little more than the ruler of a city-state, even though he claims dominion over the entirety of Osterland and beyond. Prince Wilhelm I rules Reichland, the ancient and powerful heartland of the empire, born from Sigmar's own tribal lands. Within Reichland's border, the cult of Sigmar, governed by the Grand Theogenist, holds sway, and the forces of chaos have the weakest grip upon the Old World here. This is in no small part due to institutions such as the Knights of the Fiery Heart and the Order of the Silver Hammer. Templars of both orders travel the Empire alongside the armies of Reichland, rooting out worship of the Dark Powers. Such fanaticism puts Reichland especially at odds with the Duchy of Talabheim, who they see, perhaps rightly, as a haven for pagan forces and elementalist witches. The largest, yet most disparate region of the empire, the Grand Duchy of Talabheim, is ruled by Duke Ludwig XII of the line of Ottilia. It ostensibly includes the provinces of Talabheim-land, Sturland, Averland, Wissenland, and the Moot, though in practice many of these regions are self-governing, and the cities of Talabheim and Nuln are both powerful city-states in their own right who owe little allegiance to the nobility. For hundreds of years the region has been claimed by the Attilian emperors, backed by the cult of Tal and various other cults, and rulers of the empire eager to press their own claims to the emperorship. After the collapse of the electoral state system in 1979, the duchy fractured further.